It's easy to find life on Earth. It surrounds us, and even in the most extreme environments that our planet has to offer, it often thrives. So far, our quest to find life on other planets has been unsuccessful, and the question of whether life exists outside of Earth is one for which we have no definitive answer yet, and it's not even clear whether it's going to be easy or hard to give an answer. In principle, it could be easy. An alien could turn up in a flying saucer and announce itself, or we could receive a message from a distant civilization. Or we might have to do a little bit more work, do a flyby of one of the moons of Jupiter, Enceladus, pick up some water vapor and then find that it's teeming with microbes. But it could be much, much harder still. Our guest this week is Sean McMahon. He's one of the co-directors of the UK Centre for Astrobiology, based here in Edinburgh. And we have a fairly wide-ranging discussion, which is appropriate because this is a field which touches on many things, on chemistry, on physics, astronomy, of course on biology, but also on questions of philosophy. We begin discussing what is life, for example. But where we end up is with Sean cautioning us that this quest to find life on other planets could be a very painstaking undertaking. It may not be obvious. Life may not come up to us and sort of proudly say, here I am. It may be that we need to accumulate evidence slowly and over the course of many years, even generations, before we can be sure that we've identified life on another planet. As an example of some of the problems in store, we can think of one of Sean's particular areas of research into biomorphs. These are things that look lifelike, but are produced abiotically, i.e. without biology. So they could be things that look like cells or mycelium, but are just the products of much simpler chemical reactions. Another example is we can think back to the episode with Gabor Demokos, where we talked about Oumuamua, this difficult-to-pronounce asteroid, which looks rather like a pencil. And for that reason, many people, or some people at least, thought that it was an alien spacecraft. However, Gabor's research shows that actually this kind of thin pencil-like shape is exactly what you'd expect for a rock which is being abraded by smaller rocks and dust as it moves through space. So we need to be very careful here. But I'm really excited about this field of astrobiology. It's a young field, and it's seeking to answer one of the most important questions that is answerable. Are we alone in the universe? So we may have to buckle up and wait many years, but I'm really looking forward to follow along with this research. Final note, the UK Centre for Astrobiology has its own podcast, so if you want to follow along in more detail, and I encourage you to do so, you can check out the Tartan Tardigrade. It's on iTunes and also on the web, not on Spotify. And with that, this is Multiverses. Sean McMahon, welcome to Multiverses.
Thank you.
Although it feels a bit odd saying that, given that you've invited me to your lovely office filled with rocks and books here in the University of Edinburgh. So Edinburgh has the largest astrobiology department in the UK. What is it that you study here?
I guess every aspect of what's called astrobiology, so the origin, evolution, distribution of life in the universe, part of which, of course, is the search for extraterrestrial organisms. But that's not all of it. It's also thinking about how life interacts with its planetary and astronomical environment over long time scales, including on the Earth.
One of the things that strikes me about the term astrobiology is, we think of zoology as a subfield of biology, or ichthyology. I was looking up all these last night as a subfield of zoology, so that's fish. And then there's elasmobranchology, a subfield of that, which is sharks and rays. But astrobiology is sort of prior to all those things in the chain. It's sort of above, I guess. Biology, as we study it generally, knows what it's concerned with, and it's concerned with things that we have here on the Earth. But the aims of astrobiology are somehow prior to that, or broader.
The way I think of it is, astrobiology is about trying to make connections between biology and the rest of the physical sciences, and to really understand how this thing called life, whatever it is, actually fits into our broader understanding of how the universe works. Because at the moment, we don't really know. We don't know how life starts. We don't know how many different possible forms it could take on different worlds and different conditions. It's just this sort of island that's divorced from the rest of our understanding. And astrobiology is about trying to fix that.
Yeah.
But I don't think we should get too hung up on the term or the definition of what astrobiology is, or, whether it's a discrete discipline or just a kind of meeting place for other disciplines. Ultimately, it's just a word. It's convenient at the moment. Maybe it won't be convenient as our knowledge evolves in some other way in 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
But the work that astrobiologists are actually doing, I think, makes contributions to traditional disciplines as well, from microbiology to astrophysics to geology. And the important thing is that the science is good, whether we call it astrobiology or call it something else.
Yeah. You mentioned something that maybe we don't want to get too hung up on as well, but you said whatever life is. Right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what astrobiology is looking at, where that comes from, where it's going, and where it could be sustained, I guess, in the broadest terms. But how important is it that we understand what we're looking for? Do we need a sharp definition of life, or is a woolly one or no definition at all? Can we just say, I know it when I see it?
It's kind of a controversial question. I'm not sure we always do know it when we see it. But one thing we do know is, or one thing we know a lot about, is the behaviour of life, what life actually does. We don't necessarily have a general theory of biology. Obviously, we understand Darwinian natural selection to be, in a sense, the unifying theory of biology. But it doesn't really tell you the difference between life and non-life. I mean, evolution by natural selection is something that populations do. It's not necessarily something an individual organism can do.
Right.
So it doesn't really work as a criterion for testing whether a given object is alive. It might be a product of natural selection, but perhaps the very first organisms actually weren't, because at some stage evolution had to take over or materials that had been produced some other way. So, I don't know, every definition of life that's been proposed has some problems.
Yeah.
Of course, in philosophy, coming up with definitions for things isn't always a productive research program anyway, because definitions in general tend to have flaws and gaps, and you can think of things that kind of break them.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose some people have this idea that life might be such a kind of discrete natural kind that it would be comparable with something like water, where, okay, water is H2O. There's no question that we have a perfectly we have a perfect definition for something like water.
Yeah, that's what we call, I guess, an analytic definition, right? It's just, there is no doubt.
It's either H2O or it's not water, so
yeah.
There's never any question. Whereas if we didn't know that water was H2O and we tried to define it based on its observed properties, then it would be much more difficult, because its properties are different in different conditions. Somebody said to me the other day, it would be as if we were trying to define water by getting as much data as we can about the way the waves come in on the beach.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how much data you get on the way the waves come in on the beach. You're never going to arrive at a perfect definition of water until you have a proper scientific understanding of what water actually is, which is H2O.
Yeah.
It just might not be possible to get that kind of precise definition when it comes to something like life, which is such a messy phenomenon, where we can imagine forms of life that aren't based on the same chemistry, but which intuitively we would want to call life if they have certain behaviours. But again, there isn't a simple list of behaviours that constitute the necessary and sufficient conditions for something being alive. Nobody's really been able to come up with one. The whole issue is kind of thorny. There's disagreement even about whether we need a definition. Mm-hmm. Clearly, we can do research on the core issues of astrobiology without having a definition. And we do. And maybe it will eventually come out of that research that we arrive at one. But I'm not too worried about it.
No, fair enough. Yeah. I mean, I'd agree that, all of the definitions of life that I've seen seem to, fail to capture the spirit of what's interesting about life for us. Like you say, there's this famous definition from NASA 94 where they say, it's a chemical system, self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution.
Yeah.
And you think, well, do I really care that I'm capable of Darwinian evolution, or that you're capable?
Well, you by yourself are not, I'm sorry to tell you, because you're not a population. Yeah, there's other... I mean, what does self-sustaining actually mean? Nothing alive is self-sustaining.
Yeah.
Everything requires energy and nutrients from its environment. And many things are obviously not self-sustaining. I mean, if you've ever tried to keep sea monkeys alive, you have to do a lot of work. But you're not going to say they don't qualify as being alive.
Yeah.
I guess when they came up with that definition, they were maybe trying to capture the distinction between organisms and things like viruses, which can only reproduce by hijacking the machinery of the host cell. And so in that very technical, quite specific sense, are not self-sustaining.
Yeah.
But I'm not convinced, any parasite requires something from its host organism.
Yeah.
We still want to acknowledge that parasites are alive.
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
And viruses are doing something really interesting that they can only do in the presence of things that we would accept as life proper. So it sort of like, well, viruses on the fence, you can put them on either side, and so it seems kind of arbitrary. But I guess there is always going to be some issue drawing a line with looking at life, because it is something that emerges from non-life, and presumably it's not like an on switch, right? It's not like there's nothing there and then it's there. I mean, similar to consciousness, right? I think it's gonna the features that we're interested in are going to come out in degrees. And of course, when people think about alien life, they're always excited about the top of the chain, like some little green men. But actually, what we're more likely to find, at least in our own backyard, is something very, very small. And
I think it's important to say that it's not some magical, mysterious thing about life that it's so hard to define. Most things are hard to define.
Yeah.
If you try and define a chair or a table, you quite quickly run into cases where you're not really sure if it belongs in the category or not.
Yeah.
Definitions are just not the sort of thing that science readily produces for the various natural objects that it studies, and generally doesn't bother even trying.
Yeah. I guess it's an emergent property. I mean, it's interesting. One of the approaches, we shouldn't spend too long on this because we want to, but I do find it a fascinating topic. But one of the approaches is this kind of constructor theory or assembly theory, where you look at the number of stages
that's right.
that you'd need to go through, some combining atoms into molecules and molecules into monomers and then polymers, and you say, okay, well, it's almost it's very similar to, in my mind, to Kolmogorov complexity in kind of algorithms, where you say, okay, well, this is the minimum number of, this is the minimum amount way that you could express this function.
It's the shortest program you can write.
The shortest program you could write, So it's sort of like the shortest way you can assemble something. And of course, well, there's problems with that definition in my mind, because you can probably come up with something extremely complex that just isn't lifelike. But it does capture something, which is that, well, there is going to be a certain arbitrariness in where you say, oh, now it's sufficiently complex for us to...
That's absolutely true. There are minerals, the quite rare minerals, whose lattice structure is so complicated that if you actually calculate the number of steps it takes to put atoms into that lattice, it starts to overlap with certain proteins and certain things that we would think of as biological. My favourite little factoid, by the way, about the assembly theory stuff is that when they... So this is work by Lee Cronin's group in Glasgow. They published a paper in which they used mass spectrometry to analyse the number of components that basically... So they're sort of doing it in reverse. They're breaking material down and looking at the number of fragments that you can make as an indicator of how many steps it takes to put the thing together.
Right.
And they analysed a range of different substances, and the most complicated thing that came out in their data set, and they had various organisms, rocks, minerals, different organic compounds and so on. The most complicated thing was beer. Okay. It's like far and away more complicated than all the other things, including even whiskey.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, maybe beer is what we'd call, I guess, a techno-signature or something. Like
could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something that...
Or it could just be more alive than we are, who knows?
Yeah. I've got one last thing to say on this, which is that Schrödinger had this book, What is Life? Where, frustratingly, he doesn't answer the question. He just asks more questions. And he hints at some things, entropy is important.
Yeah, kind of neg-entropy, as he called it.
Yeah, neg-entropy, which annoyed a lot of people. But, there's this aspect of sort of stealing energy and or free energy.
But then a fire does that, of course.
And fire has that. But the one thing, back onto this point of kind of lattices and so forth, he kind of second-guessed the structure of DNA before it was revealed. So that is quite impressive.
Yeah.
And he said, we need some kind of aperiodic crystal structure.
Yeah.
That's going to encode information, and it's got to be a pretty solid structure so that it can be passed on, but not so solid that it can't evolve and change, and also have interesting variation within it. And I think that's quite key. Life lives somewhere between complete randomness and complete homogeneity.
Yeah.
But it's very, very hard to pin down.
The fact is, there's lots of other things that live on that interface. There's lots of other things that exist on that interface.
Yeah.
The kinds of self-organised dissipative structures that form in far from equilibrium conditions. Everything from convection cells to the sorts of mineral precipitation processes that we study here generate really interesting structures that look very biological on that interface, but are not themselves biological.
Yeah.
For my money, the person who came closest to coming up with a properly abstract, universal image of what life is might be von Neumann. I really like the von Neumann machine, where you have these sort of entities that are capable of assimilating material from the environment, using it to build a kind of instruction tape together with the machinery necessary for decoding the instruction tape, and then sort of executing the instructions to produce a copy of themselves, including the machinery and the tape.
Yeah.
And this is something you can write a computer program to do this. And for me, that's the most satisfying general. I think that's the level of abstraction you can get to where it's still useful and interesting. Because for me, if we found a von Neumann machine that was sort of, let's say, implemented in a different chemistry, I would be very tempted to regard that as alive. So that kind of works for me. I don't know if it qualifies as a definition, but I think it's as close as anybody's really come that is still useful, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. So we don't know precisely what life is, at least in the most general sense, but we've got lots of good examples of life on the Earth. It's all around us.
In one sense, of course, we only have one example.
Well, that's true, actually. Or yeah, I suppose that's right. I mean, I guess all the indications are that life has evolved singly on the Earth, and everything comes from the same, despite the incredible variation that we see in forms.
We're all cousins.
And actually, under the hood, there's a lot of similarities in the way that everything's got ATP, and if you look at the branching structures in trees and the capillaries in ourselves and so forth.
Well, just more fundamentally, I mean, we're all genetically related to each other. You could read that straight from the DNA.
Yeah. One of the things that kind of blew my mind earlier this year is that even chemosynthetic life, so life which is not part of the food chain which we're part of, doesn't ultimately get its energy from the sun, but from chemicals, typically in hydrothermal vents or under the ground. We're all part of the same family.
That's right. Which isn't to say that there weren't other forms of life at some stage in the history of the Earth. Or even that there aren't still somewhere hidden today. I mean, we don't really know. There's this shadow biosphere hypothesis that kind of postulates that there might be radically different forms of life, even on the Earth, and we just don't really know how to find them. Which is maybe more useful as a thought experiment than it is plausible as a scientific hypothesis. I imagine that when life began, there might well have been various sort of different versions of it which may have arisen more or less independently. When you start to build an understanding of how life originated, very quickly you start to think, well, this had to happen or that had to happen. And if this had to happen and that had to happen, then it probably happened more than once and in slightly different ways. And it's, the more we understand about the origin of life, the more tempting it is to predict that it would have arisen potentially multiple times with slightly different features. And it's just, there's not going to be any surviving trace of that now. I mean, the fossil record isn't good enough to reveal forms of life with slightly different chemistry that appeared maybe transiently around some hydrothermal vent 4 billion years ago and then disappeared again, or got swallowed up by the rest of the biosphere. So we may never really know for sure.
So this is probably a dumb question, but can we even be sure that we are all related? I mean, we know that there's a lot of evolutionary features which have convergently evolved. So the same thing has popped up independently because it's a useful adaptive feature.
Yeah.
So, how certain can we be that we all come from the same random event, or I don't know how best to describe it, but the same
point of origin.
Yeah.
Well, I think we could be pretty sure because of the universality of the genetic code.
Mm-hmm.
It is theoretically possible to build the genetic codes in other ways. You can have a different number of base pairs,
right,
in the alphabet, and it still works. You can people have sort of tinkered in the lab to show that you can build organisms along different lines that have, by sort of slightly modifying the genetic code that they use, and yet all life that we know of on Earth uses the same code. And if you compare the codes of different organisms, you can fit them into this tree of relatedness, which shows you exactly how things are related evolutionarily.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can calibrate that against the fossil record to start putting dates on when different branches of the tree diverged.
Right.
And it's all wonderfully coherent and satisfying, and it fits together beautifully. Of course, there are always little areas of the tree where there's some confusion about why, let's say, a divergence seems to have happened if you believe the molecular clocks either much earlier or much later than you would think from the fossil record. And it's a technically challenging task to do this calibration and make it coherent, but so far it's been very successful. So we can be pretty sure that everything is, there's one tree of life on Earth.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that popped into my head was this chirality as well, which is just, I guess, everything is either left-handed or right-handed, depending on whether you're thinking of sugars or
amino acids.
Amino acids, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we can actually reconstruct some of the properties of the last universal common ancestor of all living things, because there's this core set of conserved genes and proteins that all organisms produce, or if they don't, we can infer how and when it was lost, so that we can reconstruct what the ancestral set of genes and proteins probably was. It's not easy to do that. It's complicated by the extent of horizontal gene transfer between different branches of the tree of life, which can make things appear more universal than they really are. You can have characters that are lost and then secondarily acquired again, and there's this sort of stochastic element. But nevertheless, you can say certain things about what that organism was able to do and which kind of metabolic cycles it was able to carry out. And it obviously wouldn't be possible to do that if we weren't starting with organisms that were all related to each other.
Well, let's catch that out a little bit. What do we, as best we understand it, what do we think that earliest life form was like, and how do we think it came about in our kind of tech stack of life, I guess?
Yeah, of course, that's a different question from what the last universal common ancestor was like, because the first organism was ancestral to that, possibly by hundreds of millions of years, maybe.
Well, take us back as far as you...
But the first organisms, I mean, it's quite likely, I think, that they were... they would have been chemosynthetic microorganisms. They would have had a cell membrane that was recognisably similar to the cell membranes of microorganisms that we find on the Earth today. They would have had some genetic code that was, depending on which model you go along with, either based on RNA or DNA. They would have needed to assimilate nutrients from their environment, and they would have needed some source of energy that was quite likely to have been the reaction between carbon dioxide and hydrogen, although we don't know that absolutely for a fact. There are models of how, particularly in alkaline hydrothermal vents, metabolism of this kind might have begun. The cell membrane is probably, in some sense, the easiest part of the puzzle, because fatty acids more or less spontaneously organise themselves into little vesicles.
Okay.
What's difficult?
That's easy to make, but you need to get the right stuff inside it.
What's really difficult is to figure out how these different systems became kind of coupled to each other, so that you have cells that are reproducing and are correctly passing on and inheriting the machinery that they need so that they can carry on metabolizing and assimilating nutrients and at some point repairing damage. And you need to kind of couple this sort of reproductive system, the metabolic system, the homeostatic machinery, and get it all kind of working together.
Yeah.
That's where it's kind of technically quite challenging to figure out exactly how this could have happened.
I mean, is it just a case of, rolling the die enough? You're creating a lot of cell membrane type structures.
Yeah.
You also maybe have some RNA or DNA type things that are in this kind of soup. And,
I'm sure. Yeah, I think there's obviously a huge random element here, where you have. We don't take this too literally, but in a sense, millions of failed experiments per second.
Yeah.
It's not like nature is trying to produce life, but it's this sort of chemistry is happening, and at some point, just by chance, because of the law of large numbers, it's gonna generate something that has the right balance of structures and properties that it's able to start reproducing itself in this synchronized way. And it might be sort of vanishingly improbable, in which case. That's totally consistent with the evidence that we have, since we've never found life anywhere else, and since we wouldn't be here if it hadn't happened.
Yeah.
So the probability can be as low as you like, and we're still in the realm of what's consistent with the evidence. There are certain other events in the history of life on Earth that may also have been sort of staggeringly unlikely, and the obvious one would be the origin of the eukaryote cell, which involved one microorganism being consumed by another one, and rather than being digested and destroyed, it was able to carry on living inside its sort of new host organism, and reproduced in sync with its host organism, and became a kind of symbiont that ultimately was just assimilated into the host, so that you can no longer say where the host ends and where the symbiont begins.
So this is mitochondria.
So mitochondria,
the power station of cells.
Chloroplasts. It's not. Somehow the nucleus may have arisen out of some of these symbiotic events. That's not very well understood at the moment. But if that hadn't happened, and it seems to have only happened, at least the acquisition of mitochondria and the origin of the eukaryote cell seems to have happened only once. Eukaryotes have their own sort of single tree that's nested within the larger tree of life.
Right.
There aren't multiple different origins of eukaryotes. Even though it could presumably happen any time.
Yeah.
It only seems to have happened once.
So if that hadn't happened, we'd still have archaea, which are, in many ways way more varied than eukaryotes. And really good at living in lots of places and surviving, but they're not going out building spaceships.
Yeah, we'd still have microorganisms, but we would never have achieved large organisms capable of building complicated, differentiated tissues and all the rest of it, multicellular life.
Okay, so life, as we know it, is pretty diverse, but still just a single point of origin. Let's talk about the kind of tech stack that we know for life at the moment. So we're kind of carbon-based, water's important, there's a few, handful of other elements that are really important. In fact, I think it's like 6 elements or something account for 99% of the biomass. So we have a kind of good idea of the ingredients that are working here on Earth. But as I understand it, even trying to look for those and use that kind of fingerprint elsewhere, that's pretty hard. But that's probably our first. Is that sort of the most obvious place to look, I guess, if we want to find either another instance of life originating here on Earth, or if we're looking elsewhere?
So it's not even clear. So there's a related issue which comes back to something you said earlier, that there's this fuzzy boundary between life and non-life. It must have been the case that on the early Earth, or wherever the origin of life actually happened, there was some kind of a transition from fairly complex but not biological organic carbon chemistry to biology. And we can argue about where exactly we want to draw that line, but wherever you draw the line, you have the same problem, that there's stuff on one side of the line that looks very much like the stuff on the other side of the line. Mm-hmm. So wherever you draw the line, you have this difficulty of drawing any real distinction between prebiotic chemistry, as we say, and biological chemistry. Mm-hmm. And so when we're looking out into the universe and finding quite complex organic chemistry, it's going to be hard for us to say, is this life, or is this just maybe the sort of chemistry that could have given rise to life, but perhaps didn't in the environment where we're looking. And this is going to be particularly difficult in the context of Mars, where we are going to be extracting from rocks 4 billion years old a suite of organic molecules which may be quite complicated and quite reminiscent of biology. And it's going to be difficult to know whether it actually is the remains of biology, or is it the remains of the sorts of chemistry which on Earth led to biology, but maybe on Mars didn't.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's difficult.
I guess in some ways, like we said, in the absence of a perfect definition of life, it almost needs to be the last explanation once we've exhausted, it's not, let's say, geophysics, right?
Yeah.
Or just organic chemistry, but without these additional things that we're interested in. So I guess you kind of need to exhaust the other possibilities to be really sure. But are there, what sort of things, like if we went to Mars, what stuff are they looking for exactly? So it's, complicated organic molecules. Are there particular, within that, can we narrow down a bit?
It's not just the molecules, first of all. It's basically they're looking for fossils broadly construed, which might include structural remains of cells or colonies of microorganisms, which we know have a fossil record on the Earth.
Yeah.
So they might find things that are just recognisably fossils, which maybe they won't be able to see until they get these samples back and put them under the microscope.
Yeah.
Or maybe in some very, very optimistic scenarios, they will actually see things with the cameras on the instrument that correspond to the kind of macroscopic expression of communities of microorganisms. So I have on my desk here, for example, an ancient stromatolite.
Okay, so I've read a lot about these.
Yeah.
I've not seen one in the flesh, as it were.
You can see it's a polished slab of rock that's got these sort of branching tree-like structures in the polished face, which are kind of capped by these dome-like layered features. And this is a product of microbes that lived on the seafloor several hundred million years ago that were trapping and binding sediment grains and precipitating calcium carbonate around the cells to form basically a kind of living rock that grew upwards as the microbes had to keep moving towards the light. And these sort of large mushroom-like rocky structures that they formed, stromatolites, are often large enough that if they exist on Mars, the rover cameras would be able to see them.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting because to the untrained eye, which mine is, that looks like a rock.
Well, it is a rock.
It is a rock. Oh, well, yeah. But it looks like it's never been living, is what I want to say.
Yeah.
And, but I suppose we can be really confident that stromatolites are a good biosignature, to use the kind of term of art. So because we have living ones now as well.
We have living ones, and sometimes the fossil ones have the fossil microorganisms trapped inside them. Although I wouldn't say that the stromatolite sort of shape or structure is by itself a completely compelling biosignature, because there are ways that non-biological processes can make structures very much like that.
Yeah.
Some of which have been studied experimentally, and here's another fun sort of factoid. A real impetus for this line of research was the observation paint in car factories building up around where the cars were being sprayed doesn't form just flat layers of paint on the floor like you might expect. Instead, it builds up into these remarkable convex columns, domes, branching structures.
Oh, wow.
And this comes out of the kind of physics of particle deposition in a way that you can actually quite easily simulate with some computer code. And it's just a general property of systems where you have the deposition of lots of small particles that are sticky in the right way, that they form these rather complex branching growth structures. And you can do the same thing for yourself if you have a can of spray paint and you just spray it onto a table. Maybe use a couple of different colours so that you can build up layers that you can see. You'll find that it doesn't just make a flat layer of paint, but it makes this rather interesting sort of knobbly structure, which if you cut into it will look a lot like stromatolite. So the shape by itself is maybe not diagnostic, but there are other features you can look at. Real stromatolites tend to have a characteristic spacing between them that comes from the fact that these are communities of organisms that depend on light and can't grow if they overshadow each other. So they tend to organise with this sort of spacing, like eggs sitting in an egg carton. You can look for microfossils inside, you can look for certain organic molecules inside, and ultimately the hope is that if we do find evidence of life on Mars, it might consist of several different lines of evidence that all agree with each other, any one of which by itself you might query, but if you have enough lines of evidence that are mutually independent but mutually supportive, it can kind of push the balance of probabilities high enough that you can be reasonably confident you found life. I think for most sort of feasible scenarios, there's always going to be a bit of room for doubt, and the job is to try and make that room as small as possible.
Yeah, this maybe seems like a good time to mention LH8401 because, that was a case. So this asteroid that was picked up in Antarctica in 1984, and then a decade or a bit more later, they found lots of evidence that there was life inside.
That's right.
But then it turned out to be not as compelling as was thought.
That's right. I remember being 9 years old and seeing on the television news Bill Clinton on the lawn of the White House announcing to the world America had found fossils from Mars.
Brilliant, yeah.
And it was very exciting. The journalists, incidentally, at this press conference were not excited at all. And you can find a clip on YouTube. The first question they ask him is not anything to do with life on Mars. It's about some measure that was going through Congress at the time to do with abortion laws. Kind of sad that this was... Yeah. They just were so blithe about the whole thing. But anyway, so there were structures inside that meteorite that looked kind of like bacterial cells, although rather on the small side, composed of minerals. There were globules of carbonate minerals that looked similar to what happens where you have microorganisms producing carbon dioxide that mineralizes around them. There were magnetite crystals, so an iron oxide, that had a prismatic shape quite similar to the magnetite particles that certain bacteria form inside their cells. And there were hydrocarbon compounds, which, although they weren't very complex organics, could have been the kind of altered remains of what was originally biomass. That was the hypothesis. So any one of these lines of evidence by itself you might query, but to have so many lines of evidence, all seeming to point to life, was thought to be pretty compelling. Yeah. I mean, there was always some doubt. Nobody ever said this is 100% watertight, even when the first announcement was made. And even in Bill Clinton's speech, there's a line about, more tests will need to be done. And of course, what actually happened is that the tests were done, and none of these lines of evidence actually held water in the end. The things that looked like fossil cells turned out to be the edges of kind of crystal lattice planes, where they kind of appear on the surface, can look at kind of like little worms, combined with the effects of coating the sample for electron microscopy that can kind of make things look more round because they're being coated. The organic compounds or hydrocarbon compounds turned out to be a combination of probable contamination and some organic compounds that actually did come from Mars, and were formed by non-biological chemical reactions. And you can tell this from the way that they're associated with certain minerals that are also produced by those same reactions. So if you look on a really fine scale, you can see that where these carbon compounds are is also where these minerals are that tell us about these reactions. So unfortunately, not biology. The magnetite crystals seem to be the product of the shock decomposition of iron carbonate minerals in the kind of heat and pressure of or particularly the shock pressure of the impact event that sent this thing on its way to Earth. And the carbonate globules turned out to be the product of hydrothermal mineral precipitation processes. So every one of those lines of evidence ended up falling down. So there are probably still some holdouts in the community who would still claim that this, on balance, looks like evidence of life. But I think if there's a consensus now, it's that actually, no, this was a very misleading, very unfortunate kind of false positive.
Well, in some ways it was. I mean, so there's a cautionary tale there for sure.
Yeah.
But it surprises me that, despite those journalists on the White House lawn not seeming impressed, the lasting effect of this seems to have been like a reinvigoration of the astrobiology program. At least that's what I've heard it as. And so the kind of first impression, we had life, is kind of what mattered. Whereas if one thinks back to Viking, where they sent to Mars some experiments which weren't particularly well thought out. And I think the people who built those experiments were like, actually, we wanted to do something slightly different, and NASA just wanted to go kind of gung-ho looking for life. Whereas, in hindsight, what would have happened with Viking is that they would have looked at more basic questions like what is the chemistry here. But anyway, the Viking results came back and were kind of disappointing because people had really high expectations. They didn't see anything. On reflection, they weren't so bad. They weren't so damning as that at all. But there was a little bit of a kind of astrobiology winter, I suppose, after that, in which everyone was slunk off. And it seemed that the research was somewhat depressed after that. So I don't know. There's also a first impressions count in a kind of PR.
There's a lot to unpack here. I mean, astrobiology has sort of been born twice out of NASA initiatives. The first time it was called exobiology, and this would have been around 1960. And at that time, a big sort of stimulus was the recent result that there seemed to be vegetation on the surface of Mars. And a Harvard astronomer called William Sinton had observed features in the spectrum of Mars that seemed to appear when Mars was showing us its darker regions and disappear when it was facing the other way. And that it had long been thought that the darker features that you could see on the surface of Mars, which kind of come and go with the seasons, must be vegetation. And the features that were observed by William Sinton in the spectrum corresponded to organic molecules. And this was cited as an important result by people like Josh Lederberg, who were really influential in sort of getting NASA to do exobiology. Later it turned out that actually these features were not on Mars. They were water vapour in Earth's atmosphere along the line of sight in the telescope observations. And actually it turns out that heavy water, so water with a bit of deuterium in it, has absorption features around 3 microns in the spectrum, the same place as organic molecules. So this was all a mistake, and yet it probably played an important role in the origin of exobiology at NASA. And then you could argue that this meteorite, ALH 84001, was also kind of interpreted in a mistaken way, but also played a really important role in the kind of second origin of astrobiology. Because not long after that, NASA got a bit more funding to do astrobiology, and the NASA Astrobiology Institute started, and astrobiology started to take off as a field. But a more positive framing of the whole narrative would just be to say these observations were not understood because the relevant science hadn't been done, and the consequence of these observations being made was that people started to put the resources in to get the relevant science done. And so, I guess the thing about cautionary tales is that almost by definition you learn from them. And we've learned a lot from the study of that meteorite. And we now have the scientific understanding to explain some of those features and to think more in a more subtle and sophisticated way about how to find evidence of life. And a lot of that understanding comes from the fact that NASA injected a lot of cash into astrobiology. So, it's an interesting story.
I think it's... one of the lessons, or one of the things it highlights, is just how hard it is. Like, I don't think anyone was doing bad science here. Like, Sinton, his hypothesis was a pretty good one, but he just didn't know that you could have deuterium in the atmosphere. Right?
Who would have thought that just by coincidence, heavy water has these features in just the same place as organic molecules? It's just a really annoying coincidence. So it shows that kind of level of, both caution and, breadth of knowledge that one needs in the astrobiology community to really check out these things. There are lots of these cautionary tales, but I don't think that's really a problem. In a way, that's just sort of how we learn. You look at the history of any science, and you'll see mistakes being made, or things that in hindsight we now understand to be mistakes, but were logical interpretations based on the understanding people had at the time. And it's just, that's how science makes progress.
And this is, we scratched a lot of my kind of general itches on the field, but I really want to come on to some of your work because it completely touches on this issue or makes contact with it in that you're trying to look for things which look like life but aren't life. I guess to sort of make us streetwise, as it were. And so we don't kind of go out there and be like, I've got it. And like, no, this is like paint on the wall of a garage.
I think... So here's a way of framing it that was put to me by an astrophysicist, Kevin Heng, at Munich. He said, searching for life, what we're really doing is looking for a signal above a baseline.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking for an anomaly above some baseline, whether we're talking about the spectrum of light captured from an exoplanet or the complexity of shapes that we can measure in the lab. In order to recognize the signal, you need to know what the baseline is.
Yeah.
So in order to recognize life, you need to know what are the non-biological processes doing in that environment that might generate interesting things that are not life. And it struck me, and a few other people as well, that most work that's been done in astrobiology has been focused on what the signal might look like. Very little has been focused on what the baseline looks like in these environments where we're looking for life.
Yeah.
And if all of these cautionary tales, and I've got a list somewhere of like 20 of them, and we've only touched on 2 or 3. In every case, there was something about the baseline that had been missed.
Yeah.
And so I think it's reasonable enough in a field that has thousands of people working in it for somebody to put the effort in to thinking about what the baseline is going to look like in these contexts where we're looking for life. So if we're looking for organic molecules on Mars, what are the non-biological organic molecules going to look like? If we're looking for the shapes of microorganisms that have been replaced by minerals and fossilized, what are the shapes of those minerals going to be that are not fossils? If we're looking at spectra from exoplanets, what features of those spectra are going to be produced by gases in the atmosphere that have nothing to do with life, or minerals on the surface that have nothing to do with life?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that these questions are kind of logically prior to any detection of life. We need to know the baseline to recognize the signal, and so that's what I work on.
Yeah. You're using surprisingly old techniques, I guess, to look at this quite new problem. So, take us through some of the things that you do to produce beautiful things that look lifelike, or biomorphs.
Yeah. So one example is the chemical garden.
Mm-hmm.
This is such an old area of science that it, in a way, predates modern science and comes out of the alchemy that was being done in the 17th century, when sort of European scholars realized that certain reactions would generate tree-like structures that you could see growing before your eyes. And to them it was kind of proof that there's this sort of rudimentary vitality in all matter. And this was the time when people believed in spontaneous generation and stuff like that. We now understand that these processes are the consequence of just physics and chemistry. But if I can describe to you what the experiment looks like, you take some crystal grains about the sizes of grains of salt that you might have in your salt shaker. You drop them into a liquid, which is water glass, an alkaline sodium silicate solution, and then that's it. You just watch, and what happens is that these crystal grains, as they start to dissolve into the liquid, produce a little kind of bag-like membrane around themselves, which is sort of flexible and porous, and pressure builds up on the inside of this membrane until it eventually ruptures, and you get these finger-like jets of fluid coming out, which spontaneously are sort of wrapped around by a new membrane that grows along the walls of these fingers. So you end up with tubes radiating from a central blob, which corresponds to where the crystals originally were, and the tubes continue to grow outwards from that central blob, and they can branch like in a tree-like way, and the branches can converge and join back together again like a fungal mycelium, and the whole thing just takes place in minutes. And then the last thing that happens is that this sort of gelatinous membrane becomes encrusted by crystals of metal oxides, so like iron oxides, so that you end up with, instead of this flexible bag-like thing, a solid object that's kind of brittle, which is sort of these little hollow tubes and branching tubes made of solid minerals, which, if you do the experiment on the right scale, are almost indistinguishable from the metal oxide tubes that certain bacteria will make, for example. So one area of my work has been to investigate whether this type of chemistry could take place on the early Earth or early Mars, and how we can differentiate between these microscopic but completely inorganic mineral growth structures on the one hand and real fossil microbes on the other hand.
And I mean, these seem like really interesting experiments in their own right, like whether or not we're interested in just demarcating that or delineating, I guess, that baseline.
Yeah.
you were discovering really interesting things about how quite simple processes can produce wonderful structures.
Yeah, the chemistry is quite simple. The physics is actually quite complicated, the fluid dynamics and so on. But yeah, it's one thing you realise when you start attending to the baseline is how interesting the non-biological universe is, and how many complicated, surprising, completely unintuitive things form out there in nature that have nothing to do with life.
Yeah. One thing I do wonder is, could we discover something as interesting as life from our anthropocentric perspective?
Yeah.
That's non-life. The thing that's sort of coming back to this Darwinian evolution point, you were saying, well, what's so important about Darwinian evolution? And we should say that it's the thing which seems to not just add noise over time, but although it's a random process in a sense, it does produce something directed. And actually, a previous guest of mine was Simon Kirby, talking about language evolution and modelling language as an organism. And remarkably, you can start off with some completely random, unstructured mapping between sounds or some kind of symbols and the world, and then just as a process of evolving that mapping through subsequent generations of learners who have kind of constraints, it will develop structure. Maybe that's why the Darwinian point is so interesting, and why perhaps there's kind of a limit to how interesting you can get with the abiotic structures.
Absolutely. Evolutionary algorithms, as you probably know, are quite an important engineering tool. But more generally, natural selection is the only way that we know nature can make structures of the order of complexity that organisms are. However, a fossil can be much simpler than an organism. And if we're looking for evidence of life on Mars, for example, most of the biological information is lost, is gone. What's left behind is a far simpler kind of residue. We have relatively simple molecules, relatively simple structures, maybe some isotopic anomalies associated with that. But you've lost that fingerprint of Darwinian evolution, which is that massive degree of complexity that we see in living cells. Now, it took us until the 1850s to get natural selection kind of figured out, let's say. So that's relatively late in the history of modern science. And even if you understand natural selection, it doesn't really give you the ability to predict that life would have the diversity and complexity that it has, because basically we're not that smart, right? You could have, if you imagine, this is quite a complicated thought experiment, but imagine that you were born without any sense of the fact that you yourself are an organism, and without any access to the living world, and you were, kept in a concrete box, but given a thorough understanding of physics, mathematics, chemistry, and the logic of natural selection. There's no way that you would guess that something like even a bacterium, the simplest form of life we can think of, would come into existence as one end of that process.
Yeah.
Because we're just not that imaginative.
Yeah.
There's a really nice poem by a Polish Nobel Prize-winning poet that's kind of along these lines about how you would never have anticipated a blade of grass or a strawberry or an insect from the best possible understanding of the logic of evolution until you'd found them.
Yeah.
And I think we might be in that same situation with respect to all kinds of things in the universe.
Right.
Where it doesn't matter how smart we are, how good our astrophysics is, how good our geophysics is, how good our chemistry is. If we're talking about the endpoints of very, very long evolutionary processes, we're not smart enough to guess what's going to be thrown up.
Yeah.
So we have to explore. And the same might be true of processes other than evolution, that they can produce things that we just never would have guessed. And I think that's what we see from exploring the baseline.
Yeah.
You find things that are so unbelievably similar to life in their sort of superficial qualities that you just wouldn't, unless you'd seen it with your own eyes, you wouldn't believe it was possible.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so maybe we will find something as exciting as life.
I think it's, I don't know, I guess it depends what you're excited by.
Well, yeah.
We'll certainly find stuff that we couldn't possibly have predicted that we would find.
Yeah.
I mean, there's basically every space mission ends up doing that one way or another. I mean, who knew that Pluto was going to be so complicated?
Yeah.
We were expecting a cratered ball of rock, and instead we found this wonderfully dynamic world with dunes and convection cells exposed on the surface with this wonderful polygonal pattern. and all these sort of interesting landscapes shaped by the way that nitrogen and ammonia behave at very, very low temperatures.
Yeah.
They're just a complete surprise.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was only, 2015 or something.
It does make me wonder, given that we are so unimaginative, I mean, coming back to this kind of tech stack, even with this kind of simple, even if we assume that carbon is the right basis for life, which I think is a good assumption, although I do want to throw out, this, wonderful ideas of science fiction writers. I love the story by Ted Chiang of Exhalation, which is, I don't know if you know this one.
I don't know this one.
But is machines with a lot of tubes, but their kind of free energy is a pressure difference.
Okay.
And so their brain is a set of kind of pumps and stuff, and they realise that they're thinking slower, but it's just because the pressure difference is kind of they're losing that.
I guess sort of
gradient.
Cartesian machine view of life.
So it's a really nice way of highlighting the kind of the free energy aspect to life. But of course, then there's Fred Hoyle's Black Cloud and was it Dragon's Egg?
Yeah, we teach our students about some of these things.
I mean, should we treat these as sci-fi, or should we take them seriously? Like, do you teach them to your students for fun, or is it like this is something that we're going to hedge our bets here?
There's a couple of different reasons why we might want to think about these things. One reason might be kind of precisely what we were just talking about, trying to make sure that we're open-minded, that we're as imaginative as we can be, that we don't shut down lines of inquiry because we have too conservative a view about what life might be. Nobody wants to be too conservative about what life might be. However, the fact is we have limited resources, we have limited observing time, we have limited time in general, and there are kind of much lower hanging fruit that we can pluck in our observations of the universe, given that organic molecules and water are so common, and as it turns out, rocky planets in the habitable zones of their parent stars are so common. To me, it makes complete sense to at least focus the majority of our astrobiological research on these well understood scenarios where we have admittedly only this one biosphere to go on, but at least we know that form of life is possible. Does that mean we should be closed-minded about other scenarios? No. But just as a matter of pragmatic utility, I think we need to look for the thing that we understand something about how to look for, maybe first, or give the weight of our effort to that, while at the same time, continuing to explore, because the solution to the problem of not being able to imagine stuff is to go out and explore the universe and see what you actually find. And this, I think, is a somewhat different activity from science, strictly speaking. I think it's very worthwhile just to go and look and see what you find without worrying about whether you're testing a hypothesis or whether you have well-defined scientific research objectives. And sometimes these things can be slightly in tension, which I think is a bit unfortunate. Sometimes the reason for going to look at an environment should just be we haven't really looked at it before, rather than that we have a really nicely defined, well-considered kind of model of how a certain phenomenon may or may not take place there that we want to test. We need to do both things.
I forget the quote, but I think it was Shelley who said something, science starts in poetry. That idea traces back to the Greeks as well. But I think you're absolutely right that on both points. Firstly, that there needs to be a spirit of inquiry which is kind of pre-scientific, and gives that kind of inspiration to science. But on your first point as well, that let's look in the obvious places first. And astrobiology is still really young in many ways. We only confirmed the first exoplanet in 1995, but since then, like Kepler, just looking at 0.25% of the sky and just focused on our galaxy, has found coming up to 3,000 confirmed exoplanets, with a bunch of them in what we call the habitable zone. So within that kind of carbon based way of life, in the place where we think that could work, right? So there's already just been an explosion in the number of places where we could look, and I suppose we've just not had the tools. Like, we're only now building the telescopes that will be able to do the look at the spectral bands
Yeah.
from those planets, and figure out, does it look like there's some vegetation there that's photosynthesizing and absorbing relevant wavelengths. Does it look like there's something which is putting unusual concentrations of complicated hydrocarbons into the atmosphere?
I think it's tempting to just sort of want to jump to the end of what will actually be a long scientific program that probably takes place over several generations before we get clear answers. I don't buy this line that we're going to know that there's life in the universe within 20 years. And we might get lucky, but I think it's sort of foolish to set up that expectation in people's minds. Not least because we still don't know enough about the baseline in these contexts. There's even an argument that before we even start trying to analyse habitable planets, we should start by analysing uninhabitable planets, so that we have an understanding of just how diverse and complex and different from each other planetary atmospheres can be in environments where we know there's no life, at least no life as we would normally conceive it. So I don't know, I'm not sure I totally buy that argument, although I think it's along the right lines. What's actually going to happen is that we're going to find surprises, we're going to find anomalies, we're going to find molecules we didn't expect to find in atmospheres where it may even be hard to imagine how a life could possibly be producing them, but we just can't think of anything else because the science hasn't been done yet. I mean, this situation's already arisen at least 3 times. First with methane on Mars, then with phosphine on Venus, and then with possible DMS in K2-18b, where some of these detections are not very robust, but people have jumped very quickly to the conclusion that it could be life, and maybe it could be, but I just don't think that conclusion is motivated until we have a much better understanding of the physics and chemistry of these environments. So I think it's important that people be cautious and circumspect and don't necessarily believe the first press release that gets put out about these things, because usually when the truth comes out, it's much less exciting than the journalists wanted it to be.
Yeah.
But I'm not being pessimistic. I just think these things take time. And as you say, this is quite a young field, and we're only just beginning to be able to get the kinds of data that we need, let alone understand and interpret those data correctly. Yeah. So let's be patient, I think, is the bottom line.
I think that's an important psychological call to arms in some ways, that this could be, as you say, multi-generational process, almost like updating your, Bayesian updating as you go.
Exactly. Yeah, and it might be a very slow incremental process.
Yeah.
Where even though we have some suggestive evidence, it takes a lot more follow-up work over a long time to get that posterior probability above your threshold of credibility.
Yeah. I can imagine. Yeah, we find some things with the next generation telescopes, but then that's it. Oh, actually, we need a new telescope or a new experiment. Those things take a long time to build and fund.
I think a Bayesian sort of approach is the right way to go. And in this respect, I may be actually less negative about things than some colleagues. So you mentioned earlier on that maybe life should only be the hypothesis of last resort. And I don't actually agree with that. I think that's unscientific, just to say this hypothesis is like intrinsically unacceptable. I think we just need to follow the evidence wherever it points. And if the evidence isn't very good, then it motivates only a small adjustment to our Bayesian, probabilities. But it still motivates some adjustment. And hopefully over time the evidence will get better and accumulate in one direction.
You read a fun paper called on Carl Sagan's famous dictum, extraordinary hypotheses or extraordinary claims.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Yeah. This gets wheeled out a lot, and I don't agree with it. Yeah,
it's a nice pithy,
Yeah, I mean, okay, so it definitely is correct in certain contexts. So if you have a hypothesis which has a low prior probability, then you can see straight away from Bayes' theorem that you're going to need evidence that has certain properties in order to get that posterior probability above the line. You're going to need evidence that you would only get if the hypothesis were true, that you're not going to get otherwise. So there's that formal logical sense in which if your hypothesis has a low prior probability attached to it, then yes, it requires evidence that you might say is extraordinary. Also, if you have a hypothesis, the truth of which would entail the falsehood of many other things that are well known to be true.
Yeah.
Like maybe your hypothesis is that horoscopes work.
Yeah.
Well, if that were true, then a lot of what we know about physics has to be wrong.
Yeah.
So it's harder to just assign a probability to that.
Yeah.
But it's an extraordinary claim that would require extraordinary evidence, because the evidence would somehow have to overbalance all the evidence that we already have for our existing understanding of physics.
Yeah.
But the discovery of extraterrestrial life isn't like either of those situations. Extraterrestrial life, the existence of extraterrestrial life, doesn't conflict with any well-understood physics and chemistry, doesn't require us to rewrite the textbooks on physics, and it's also not something to which we can just straightforwardly assign a very low prior probability.
Yeah.
In fact, if you look at the Drake equation, which perhaps you shouldn't, but you can.
I have an issue with the Drake equation, but we'll come at it.
So it's this idea that you can, if you multiply the number of stars by the fraction of those that have habitable planets, by the fraction of those that develop life, by the fraction of those forms of lives that develop something that we can actually observe, and so on.
Yeah.
You get to the end of this multiplication, you come up with a number that tells you how many observable civilizations or observable forms of life we might predict that we're going to be able to see.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring this up is just that the uncertainties attached to each one of the terms in the equation are such that you can end up with any number you want.
Yeah.
But that in itself tells you that we can't straightforwardly assign a low probability.
Yeah.
Because the evidence we currently have allows us to put basically any number on how much extraterrestrial life there could be that we could observe.
Yeah.
So for these reasons, I don't think the existence of extraterrestrial life just by itself is an extraordinary claim in the sense that would be required for Sagan's pithy dictum actually to apply to it.
Yeah.
So I think the right response when you see a press conference about extraterrestrial life has been discovered isn't to say, I'm not going to allow that because that's an extraordinary claim.
Yeah.
The right response is to say, how good actually is the evidence?
Yeah.
How much do we actually understand about the abiotic processes operating in the environment that this data comes from? And if necessary, make some proportionate adjustment to your beliefs.
Yeah.
Which can be a very small adjustment if the evidence isn't very good. But that's the rational way to proceed.
Yeah. But very quickly on the Drake equation, one thing it seems to be missing, so I think one of the terms is proportion of intelligent life. You get to that and then you're like, and the number of, the number of the intelligent life, or the proportion that then develops the ability to communicate. But there's a term which doesn't seem to account for our ability to recognise the communication as such, right? And so I'm just, if life is operating on a very different timescale, we just might not see it, and it could be super intelligent. It could be so rapid or so slow.
There's two timescales you have to think about. One is the timescale for which that civilization is actually producing stuff, and the other one is the timescale for which the stuff it produces can be observed. Yeah. And if it makes, let's say, there's this hypothetical idea that extraterrestrial life might produce kind of autonomous robot probes that can reproduce themselves and spread through the galaxy. Yeah. These could have an indefinitely extended lifespan, long after the civilization itself has come and gone. So that's, I don't know if I buy this, but that's one argument for thinking that we should invest at least a little bit of our time and scientific resources in looking for techno-signatures, because they might have this incredible longevity, far more than the biosphere that actually produced them. And then in that case, they might be the form of life that we could most easily detect, even though they might be the thing least likely to be produced in the first place, because we imagine that most biospheres are just going to be microbes. If technosignatures are produced by even one civilization that decides to propagate their machinery through the universe, maybe to send out probes to do research or whatever, if that's happened only once, we might have a much better chance of detecting that than all these millions of worlds of microbes.
Well, Neumann machines are very good at replicating. So if we saw a von Neumann machine, that would be a pretty good technology. I want to throw out some other technologies. If we saw an obelisk, like in 2001, that would be a good one. Also, a gombots.
I don't know what that is.
It's this shape. So an obelisk is sort of like at one end of the... it's just one bracket to the naturally occurring shapes. Like you never get something so perfectly... You never get a perfect cube in nature. And the way you can sort of...
You can get pretty close for certain crystals.
Pretty close. So the guy who's done work on this is Gabor Demarcate, and he points out that if you look at the number of balance points and you use that or the number of vertices as well, you find that things approximate Qs but never quite there. And at the other end of the spectrum, things approximate the Gombots, which just weirdly just has one stable and one unstable gap balance point, whereas most stuff has at least two.
Okay.
That's something that never occurs, and it's so precise, like nature can't really manufacture it. So I throw that out. I mean, the other classic example of a technosignature is a pulsar. But, and I mention that because it turned out to be really fruitful to look for those things, but not because we found evidence of an alien civilization, but we found pulsars. But coming back to Sagan's dictum, I've wandered a bit off a track here. Yeah, I think you're right, and I think it's maybe an example of kind of a meme which sounds really good, but propagates by virtue of its catchiness rather than it's
got that lovely sort of
virtue.
Formal symmetry to it that makes it sound like it must just be true.
It also lights upon probably a cognitive bias that we have. Like I think probably captures something that we do, but we probably shouldn't do. And the place that comes to mind is within the interpretations of quantum mechanics is another perennial itch I have to scratch. One of the kind of objections to the many worlds interpretation, the Everest interpretation, is just like, you cannot be serious, right? and I think that is an instance of, come on, that's just too out of this world.
Yeah.
But actually, really, in many ways, it's the simplest explanation.
Yeah.
And that's what you should be focused on. Yeah, rather than this kind of gut reaction, gut feel.
I think somewhere in the sort of new atheism arguments from the 90s and early 2000s, there was this sort of jokey line about the argument from personal incredulity.
Yeah.
Like, just because you happen to find something difficult to believe has no bearing on whether it's likely to be true or not.
Yeah.
Maybe that's putting things a bit too strongly, because we have certain intuitions for evolved reasons, but in general, yeah.
So I feel like we've scratched so many of my itches. Like this has done a really good self, but I don't know if you have some kind of final thoughts. I thought it was really interesting what you mentioned about we sort of need to settle in for the long run on this. But I'm curious about the null hypothesis, as it were.
Yeah.
The kind of rare earth hypothesis that we are unique in the universe, or even if not unique, just so rare that we would not expect to find any other instances. Part of me hopes that astrobiology proceeds and keeps on incrementally adding evidence that there is life elsewhere. We see some exoplanet, it's got the right signatures, we find more and more evidence, and discard other things that could have produced those signatures. But there's a logical world, at least out there, where that doesn't happen. And in some ways, that in a way is even more fascinating, because how long would we have to go? Like, it's much easier to produce, you just can't produce evidence for the null hypothesis here, right? You can just not find life. Well, you can't prove, you could prove that it's so rare that...
There are certain ways the universe might be that we can progressively eliminate. So there's a version where every different planet has its own particular form of life that's evolved to whatever the conditions are there.
Yeah.
This was a plausible hypothesis, a century ago. Now it isn't. Because, as Sagan said, we don't see silicon-based giraffes strolling around the surface of Mars.
I think it was quite religiously motivated, right? People thought if God went to the trouble of creating a world, he'd put stuff on it.
There's a secular version of the same argument, but it's still not a very good argument. It could be that wherever you have liquid water and some source of energy and nutrients, life appears. That's another possible world that was maybe getting to the point now of being able to say that's actually not right. Because it seems as though there is liquid water, at least in the subsurface of Mars, and there certainly was abundant liquid water on the surface 4 billion years ago, and also plentiful carbon and nutrients and energy and so on. And so if there was life on Mars, chances are we're going to find some trace of it. We have the right approach now to actually answer that question. And one kind of convenient thing about life is that it doesn't just sit in one place. It spreads and evolves and ends up everywhere.
Mm.
And so if we don't find any evidence that there was life on Mars in these 4 billion-year-old rocks, for me, the simplest and best explanation of that is that life didn't appear on Mars.
Mm.
You can't absolutely rule out that it maybe didn't appear maybe it appeared in some very local place and disappeared very quickly. But I think if life appeared at all, it probably spread everywhere, because that's what life does. I mean, on Earth, every single habitable environment pretty much is inhabited. Mm. We can get to the point where we can say, actually, you had these 2 planets early in the history of the solar system, Earth and Mars. They were very similar. They both had all the right conditions for life, and only one of them actually became inhabited. Mm-hmm. And so now we can eliminate the scenario where just having water and nutrients, energy and so on is enough, which means the whole universe then looks different, because it means all these habitable planets that we may find orbiting other stars, we don't have any actual good reason to think just because they're habitable they're actually inhabited.
Yeah.
And so we can make progress in this way, even if we can never absolutely say, we've searched everywhere, because we can't search everywhere.
Yeah.
And similarly, we only have to find life once on another planet.
Well, yeah.
And then the whole universe looks different.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't think but there are several different null hypotheses about how life might be distributed, only one of which ultimately is that there's just no life at all anywhere. That last one maybe is impossible to prove, but we can certainly work towards it, even if we never reach it, kind of like an asymptote.
Well, I can pretty much prove that there is life somewhere, because I'm looking at you right now.
Yeah, okay. Anywhere else. I forgot the word else. Yeah.
I thought you might have been in some kind of simulation argument, but I think even the simulation argument presupposes that there was probably some life to create the simulation.
We could all be brains in a jar.
That's true. We could be a Boltzmann brain, and that probably wouldn't be life.
I think I agree also that non-detections are just as interesting as detections. One big motivation for doing astrobiology is to get a clearer sense of how, as I said at the beginning, how life as we know it fits into our bigger picture of our understanding of the universe, and how we ourselves fit into our bigger picture understanding. Yeah. Are we an anomaly, or are we the usual thing that crops up in the right conditions? Yeah. And either answer, as you say, is very interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think either answer would be... It's weird. It's a situation which I think either answer would completely change our view of the world. Which seems wrong, because we...
Yeah, I don't know about that, actually, because... I think if you ask people, most people already kind of have a hunch that life probably exists elsewhere.
Right.
And it doesn't seem to change. It doesn't seem to be important to them that they have this hunch. It doesn't seem to entail a radical lifestyle change, or I don't know. It's a bit like we could have said all the same things about God, right? If God exists, then holy shit. If God doesn't exist, then holy shit. Yeah. But one of those things must be true. Yeah. And everyone believes one or the other, pretty much. And yet... we all seem to just carry on our lives much the same way, more or less. Yeah. At least in our model of civilization. So I don't know, I think sometimes people exaggerate how important the discovery of extraterrestrial life will be. I'm not even sure it would be in the news for more than a week, to be honest. I'm not as cynical about this as some people. I was at an event once where there was somebody representing the UK Space Agency, a civil servant, and he said this incredibly cynical thing about how actually most people out there care more about what's going to happen in the next episode of EastEnders than whether there's life on Mars. And I really didn't like it, but I don't know, he might be right.
Yeah, I think there's a sense in which I don't disagree, in which, we have these everyday concerns. Yeah. And yet there's a sense, maybe the same thing happened when Copernicus was like, hey, it's actually the other way around. Yeah. Right? But
in the long view, it was massively important, but for people living at the time...
Exactly. They're probably like, oh yeah, where am I going to get my McGraw from tonight? But yeah, in the long view, and maybe it would be an incredible discovery.
Yeah. I just don't expect it to... I think it will probably be a bit anticlimactic in some ways for people that actually live through it, even though in the long term it might really change the future of humanity.
Well, setting us up like that, we're not going to be disappointed, right?
Yeah.
Oh, well, this has been a real pleasure. I particularly enjoyed looking around your labs and seeing that this isn't all just writing the Drake equation on the board over and over and trying to think through.
We do actual science.
Do actual science, yeah. I can confirm there are microscopes. There it is. Brilliant. Yeah, thanks so much, Sean.
Well, thanks for having me along. It's been really fun.